Hello, everyone, and welcome back down here to the Gamer's Den with me, your host, Jordan, your master of lore and storyteller extraordinaire. Now, I want to remind everybody go ahead and get into the comments section, cast your votes for which class from Pathfinder First Edition you'd like to see me cover next here on the channel. But for today's episode, we have something that's it's not quite filler, but it's a story I want to share, and it's another Tales from the Table. And this one is for a game of 5th edition that I've gotten to kind of run a handful of times off and on with some friends of mine across the wonderful interwebs that have allowed us to keep on gaming, albeit sporadically, through the midst of this pandemic. And today's story actually focuses particularly on the party's monk, a gnome monk named Joyaris. And this is for 5th edition Dungeons and Dragons. We're running around in Faerun in the Forgotten Realms. And the characters are about level 3 at this point. In the party, we also have Ryder, also called Erebus, a dragonborn fighter who's going the Eldritch Knight path. Then we also have Istrin, a tiefling paladin. Hasn't quite figured out what oath she wants to take yet. I'm allowing the player a bit of time and flexibility there. And then we also have Thalin, a dragonborn druid. Now, the reason why this story focuses a bit more on the monk is, well, I've been trying to give the players flexibility in figuring out their backstories, their families, or in Joyaris's case, the temple that he came from and the kind of monastic traditions that they might have, what their fighting style looks like, or do they have multiple fighting styles, things like that. And the thing we kept landing on was we didn't want to just come up with the typical Eastern martial arts kind of styled monk. Not that those are bad things, not by any stretch of the imagination. It's just we wanted something different this time around, and no shame in that, honestly. And it's fun and it keeps things interesting. And it hit me at a point when we were wrapping up a boss fight. Actually, it was one that we had ended the previous session on a cliffhanger. Istrin was confronted by her brother, and the two of them were about to duel it out in the stables with her own horse being held hostage, and she very much so did not want anything bad to happen to the horse, but neither was she going to let her older brother get away with threatening her friends, or her dearest friend, the horse. Don't remember the horse's name, but it's somewhere in my notes. Anyways, not relevant to the story. Next session, the boss fight kicks off, and they are just beating the snot out of this poor guy. It actually went very much so against him. And at one point, the player running Joyaris says, well, I'm going to vault off of the stable door and just drop the people's elbow on him. And it hit me. We could go with luchadors. Luchadors, WWF style kind of fighting, only, lethal and painful. Well, the stunts that they perform are definitely painful, but designed to actually injure rather than be performative. So, I pitched the idea to the player when we had our break. I got in touch with them over Messenger and said, what do you think about WWF-styled luchador gnome monks as your temple's fighting tradition? And he was absolutely on board, and we both kind of went back and forth on it a little bit. He gave me the go-ahead to set up the temple's bylaws and, of course, created some NPCs and all of that. And I decided it was time to kind of capitalize on this, because the previous session had been Istrin heavy, so now it was time to start moving on to some of the other player characters. In this case, like I keep saying, Joyaris. And they journeyed back to his temple, and they actually managed to score teleportation back to his temple because their order's Grand Master had died. He had perished, and it was now time to begin the election process to get a new Grand Master for their order. And yes, election process. The temple was called the Snowy Heights Temple, and it's located in the spine of the World Mountains, kind of more on the southern side of it, but still. Windswept, snow piling high, dreadfully cold. an absolutely ideal place for monks to train, to especially emphasize that mind over matter kind of aspect of their training, to maintain that discipline and that focus. But it's still an order of luchadors. It's a bunch of gnome monks, although it's not solely gnomes, they still allow outsiders. Ability is all for this temple. It's just it was originally founded by gnomes. Several of the people who still live there are gnomes, but the diversity is growing slowly there. Although again, it's just based around ability. So they all get to craft various personas and fighting styles kind of built around it. Do they use the ropes more? Do they use the terrain? Do they do throws or grappling or all different kinds of strikes and air attacks, stuff like that? And there's different bonuses built in around that kind of depend on the persona a little bit, but the player hasn't quite figured out what they want to do just yet. But when they get there, they explain the rules for how they go about electing the new Grandmaster at the Snowy Heights Electoral Kumite. All the different members of the temple are divided up in different brackets according to their relative skill levels, or in character levels, basically. It's going to be a fairly close match. Some fights might be more challenging than others, but it should, in theory, be possible for the player to win. And the winner out of each bracket wins themselves an electoral seat. And then they get to cast a vote for the master once all the electoral seats have been filled. And there are 3 candidate masters, neither of which can participate in the fighting, but they can try to campaign and win over the different electoral seats to cast their votes for them. And then, if there's no clear majority, at least out of those 3, then the candidate master with the lowest number of votes is removed from the poll, and then all of those electoral winners who cast their votes for the person removed get to recast their votes for their next preferred candidate. So that way, it's actually majority rules, and in theory, it should be the person elected should be the one who is determined by the temple at large to be the most fitting for helping to run the temple. And the fights were just absolutely great and incredible. The players, I'm happy to say, threw themselves full bore into what I had planned for them. One of the candidate masters, Garm, the master of the vault for the temple, basically the temple's treasurer, explained that each fighter was allowed to have a support crew. They tended to wounds, did water, but one of them was the entrance master, using whatever spells or abilities they had access to create special effects as part of their entrance as they came up to the ring. And, well, he went, for this next position, there's just no word for it in your tongue. But each fighter is allowed a hype man, somebody to build them up and sing the praises of their legends. Somebody whose presence is there solely to lend voice to their actions and sway the crowd and entertain the crowd. And the players just absolutely died. My wife actually threw herself into that role. She's playing as Ryder, the Dragonborn fighter. And the thing is, she had no idea what any of that entailed. She just knew she wanted to do it. And my God, it was absolutely magnificent hearing her try to ramble on and build things up, talking about Joyaris' ample ass and all the sass that he had. And it just thoroughly confused the crowd of the NPCs. We rolled charisma checks and reactions for everything, and I think in spite of everybody else's performances, when it came time for Joyaris to actually roll the checks, even with the advantages his team was providing him, I think the highest he'd gotten the whole night out of the 3 times he got to roll was an 11. Otherwise, it was 8s, 5s. I think there was a 2 in there at one point, so the crowd very much was not on his side. The other thing to mention is the temple allowed betting. There were odds displayed. There were bookkeepers ready to go. The catch to it all was the temple got a 5% take on whatever winnings came out. And the players definitely made out there pretty well too. And the kinds of NPCs that I threw at Joyaris over the course of the fighting, we had um, the the Stone Monkey, uh, Amaric the Stone Monkey, that went up against him. Very built all the way around using the ropes and slamming into him, and was otherwise just being immovable. Then we had Garrus the Giant Killer, uh, heavy strikes, lots of grappling and throws, bringing the target to the ground, and then just striking them while they were on the ground. And then we had Grimjaw, the Iron Mummy, probably his deadliest opponent in the bracket. I could have written up several others because it was a wider bracket. He had to wait his turn for his first match. But really, for a tournament kind of like that, you don't have to worry about listing every single fighter because each of those other NPCs, they had their own matches, so they're going to be crossing people off the list anyways. So why really put yourself through all that extra work creating more NPCs? Well, unless you really wanted to randomize it, but it's a lot of extra work. This way, I just had 3 NPCs to throw at them, could craft some personalities, as well as think up some general uh, smack talking kind of lines to throw back and forth. And some of them were fairly brutal, fairly on point, and then the best Joyaris could do was go, yeah, well, you're gonna lose anyways. That's not quite the voice that he does, but it's kind of close. It's almost Yoda voice, which just sells the whole thing and makes it even better. But yeah, doing WWF styled kind of luchador gnome monks just presents the most bonkers off the wall kind of imagery, and I absolutely love everything about it. And I highly recommend that you DMs out there, you players, try it for yourselves. Come up with your own fighting style techniques. How do you work flurry of blows into it? Well, I mean, you know, just uh just describe it as it's styled like these things, but it's built and meant to do damage rather than be performative. You can do performance with it. Hell, see if you can convince your DM to allow you to take some kind of get proficiency with some kind of performance skill as part of it, or use your combat skill with charisma for when you're doing performances. If you're putting on shows, things like that can help to make the characters that much more interesting and provide some degree of variation. I mean, hell, given that there's alternate uh, kinds of character builds that you can do with, like, Eldritch Knight and all these various options that each of the character classes gets. I mean, we as DMs could very easily build something like a luchador option for the monk character class, just to add in a bit more zany color and personality. And, well, it doesn't always have to be thoroughly zany, but you get the idea nonetheless. It certainly was a lot of fun, especially throwing it into this kind of a tournament situation where each of the players had something to do each match. I mean, at one point, I even threatened one of the player characters with a couple of bodyguards from a guest nobleman who was present for the tournament that had lost a significant amount of money in gambling and betting against Joyaris, and that still adds in yet more layers of intrigue and opportunity for the players to play. But